happy Sunday evening. I guess for you, it's Monday morning or the rest of this beautiful week. First, I want to say, as a person from the great state of Texas, this snow is beautiful. I lived in Southeast Texas, close to Houston and Galveston, so it snowed maybe 2 or 3 times in my life. I always forget that I've been away from there for at least 10 years at this point, but the snow is still, it's just exciting and beautiful. So that being said, I wanted to talk to you about this week because the content is dense. So I'm going to go through the Nearpod activity with you and kind of explain what you're seeing. Somewhere down the road, you will do an activity where you'll pick either an intervention selection model where you do an FBA or where you use the life course model. So I want to be fairly clear with the work this week and with the explanations. So let's just start with screen sharing. So you should be able to see week 3, school mental health, right? This should be nothing new for you by now, although at some point I'm going to throw in some more activities besides Nearpod. But for this week, let's just look at week 3 Nearpod. So the first is an inspirational video. I love TEDx videos, and I think it's great for you to learn from other people, right? Kind of put it all in perspective. The second slide is a PowerPoint/video of a student describing what evidence-based means. And you'll see that I start this lesson, week 3, kind of pounding on the idea of evidence-based because that's super important to me. When I ask you to present your lessons, with the exception of the lessons that you're going to do on COVID, because there's no research at this point to talk about what COVID has done to schools, or if there is, there's minimal. But after that, when you start looking at the different areas and the interventions to address the problems, it's important for me that you talk about evidence-based interventions. So I will give you reading information that contains interventions with evidence. So it's important to me that that's what you use when you teach your lesson, not common or popular strategies for teaching, but what really has research support. So it's really important to me that you listen carefully as she talks and that you read this document. This document was written by Brian Cook and Samuel Odom, and what they talk about is the next step. So it's kind of like, these are evidence-based practices, but they're not effective unless someone implements them in a school, right? I mean, as researchers, we can find evidence-based practices forever. We can do the research on those things. We can figure out what works and what doesn't, but without educators in the field implementing those interventions, then we're wasting our time. So it's really important to read that and kind of think about what creates the research to practice gap. What is creating that problem where we have evidence-based interventions and then we go into schools and we see things other than evidence-based interventions happening in most schools, not all, but some. And then you're going to take a quiz on evidence-based interventions so I can kind of get a handle of where you are. It's not an easy concept. I guess I have to go through all the questions on the quiz quickly. You can do the quiz yourself. And then we start. So the Nearpod activity is going to teach you about selecting interventions either from functional behavioral assessments or the life course model. So we're going to start with FBA, functional behavioral assessments, and I'm sure you've heard about FBAs. So before you begin, it's important that you understand the difference between interventions, accommodations, and modifications. I'm sure that you have heard those words used interchangeably over and over and over again. If you've read any of my research about accommodations, it's super important that you understand that the basics of what they mean and that they shouldn't be used interchangeably. So the word intervention is a strategy to teach someone how to do something. So if I want to teach you how to pay attention, then I might use self-management to help you manage your time and learn when you're paying attention and how to increase your ability to pay attention. On the other hand, an accommodation removes an expectation, not the academic level of an assignment, but an expectation for you to learn to pay attention. So I'm going to give you extended time because you're not going to pay attention the whole time. So I'm going to give you more time to try to pay attention. There are very few accommodations that have empirical support or evidence-based. So it's really important that you think about those things when you're selecting interventions or accommodations for students. You'll see that in the life course model and in my philosophy, it's more important to try to teach skills than to remove expectations through accommodations. So if it's possible, that's important. And the third one is modifications. With modifications, we actually lower the academic standard that we're teaching, right? So that's the difference there. This is a video with Kathleen Lane where she talks about how to actually do a functional based assessment. And then these are the 6 steps of FBA. You can read all this. When these slides are just text, it's important for you to read them and think about them, and they should go hand in hand with some of the things you're reading, I hope. So this is when we start really talking about doing an FBA. Okay, so the first step in doing an FBA is determining the problem behavior. So I want you to think about a student that you know or a student that you've made up in your mind and identify a problem behavior. One problem behavior that's observable and measurable. So don't tell me the kid has a bad attitude, although we think we can observe a bad attitude. I can't really count that, right? But if I tell you that the student throws his pencil across the room, I can observe that and I can count it. So I can see it and I can count it. So then there's an open-end question where you're going to describe the problem of the student that you thought about. It's one sentence, guys, not a whole bunch of words. So like I wrote, for example, Cedric uses inappropriate language at least 3 times a day. I can see it, I can count it. The second step is to determine what happens before. So what happens before your student demonstrates that behavior? Again, one sentence. What happened immediately before that behavior occurred? So again, you're going to write it out. And in my example, I said that the teacher asked Cedric to complete an assignment. So at this point, all you would write is the teacher asked Cedric to complete an assignment. So the next step is to determine what happens after the behavior. So what you'll notice is that if a behavior keeps happening over and over and over, then the consequence for that behavior is actually maintaining it. So think about that, because we think of consequences always as a negative thing, but that's not true. In the case of Cedric, he gets sent out of the room when he uses inappropriate language. So think about it. He thought the work was too hard. He cussed. The teacher sent him out of the room. What did that do for him? That let him escape doing the hard work, right? So that consequence by sending him out of the room is not going to change that behavior. It's maintaining the behavior. In fact, he's getting what he needs to happen by using that language. It could also gain something. So a lot of times behavior is aimed at gaining attention, either from the peers or a teacher. But you only know that if the thing that happens immediately after the behavior is that the student gets attention from someone. Okay. Step 4 is identifying a setting event. So the setting event actually occurs, wow. The setting event occurs here in this block. It's distant from everything else. So a lot of times students get confused with setting events and start thinking that the setting event is an antecedent. Be careful, because a setting event is something that happens distant. So if the student wakes up tired, if the student's hungry, those behaviors are more likely to occur. The student doesn't take his medicine in the morning, the behavior is more likely to occur. So you're going to list your setting event here. And I said for Cedric, it's more likely that he and his mother have an argument in the morning. It's more likely his behavior will occur if that happens. There we go. So this is a summary statement. I'm not sure what this went with, but it simply reads like the student is asked to read aloud. He displays disruptive behavior, and he escapes reading task. And that's more likely to happen when he doesn't have his breakfast. Again, it's that simple. Don't make it long and complicated. So you'll write your summary sentence here for the student that you were talking about. It looks just like this, guys. It doesn't look like paragraphs and paragraphs. When James is asked to read aloud, he engages in disruptive behavior by throwing paper at other students. His teacher sends him to the office where he remains until reading time is over. His behavior during reading is even worse on days when he doesn't eat. So it's likely the function is also escape in that one, right? So here you're going to write your summary statement. The next step, after you've determined what the function of the behavior is when you're doing an FBA, is to pick a replacement behavior. And then you select a training intervention to teach the replacement behavior. You select an antecedent intervention, a consequence intervention, and then you determine how you're going to monitor that behavior. So you're not going to have to do all of that in this lesson, but I want you to think briefly about a replacement behavior. What would you like for the student to do that gets him the same thing as the inappropriate behavior? So Hector in the example was trying to escape math, right? So just your replacement can't be that Hector does his math because Hector's figured out how not to do his math. So let's give him an appropriate way to start with to not do his math. So you could say, he can do one problem, skip the next one, do the next one. So at least he will get out of half of his math. He could ask to work in a group, so he could do his math with someone else. He could ask to work on the computer. He could ask for teacher help. There's a lot of things he could do that would remove the need for him to misbehave to get out of doing the work. It's kind of tricky, but think about it. The next thing you'll do, not in this activity, but when you get to the place where you're going to select interventions, then you'll think about an antecedent intervention. So what can you do to change what happens before the behavior? So with Hector, the behavior happened after someone handed him a math worksheet. Guess what? I'm not going to hand him a math worksheet. I'm going to do some peer tutoring where he works with another student. Maybe he uses manipulatives. Maybe he uses a marker board, right? Yeah, those types of things. I give him a choice of assignments. Which one of these would you like to do? Once you've changed that, then you want to change the consequence. If you know that sending Hector to the office is what he wants, then don't send him to the office. We're trying to decrease the behavior, not increase it, right? So maybe you change what's happening with Hector to immediately reinforce when he doesn't engage in that behavior. For example, when I taught an adaptive behavior classroom, I had a student named James, and I knew that when I handed James something to do, he was going to get angry. So before I handed it to him, I would say, James, I'm going to hand you this sheet, and I know that all you have to do is take this worksheet from me, and if you can do that without throwing it on the floor, then you don't have to do your work. I started there, building it up, right? So what are you going to do immediately after he does, immediately after the behavior? The other thing is if Hector throws his paper on the floor, one option I have is to walk away, right? I don't have to send him out of the room. We can also teach Hector to ask, to not have to do his work or something to that effect. So first, you're going to select an and then you're going to think about a setting event intervention. If a lot of this goes with check in, check out, which I'm sure you're all aware of. So if Hector comes in and he's hungry, then he would tell the teacher he's hungry, he didn't eat breakfast, and she would help him get food. If Hector comes in and he's had a big argument with his mom, then maybe the counselor needs to speak to him. Then you're going to train the student to do the replacement behavior. So if we want Hector to ask for a break before beginning a difficult task, then we're going to practice that, just like you would teach an academic skill. You're going to tell him, so you're going to describe it first. Hector, when you feel frustrated and you think the work is too hard, then you're going to ask for a break. Then you're going to practice it. You're going to hand Hector a worksheet and you're going to say, Hector, it's too hard. And he's going to ask for a break and you're going to reinforce it. And you're going to do it. So you're going to describe it, you're going to model it, you're going to practice it, and you're going to provide reinforcement every time he does it, just like you teach an academic skill. So here you're going to talk about what replacement behavior you want to teach the student that you were describing earlier in the lesson. This talks about progress monitoring. Okay, so that kind of sums up briefly what a functional behavioral assessment looks like. Now let's talk about the life course model. The life course model was developed by my mentor, Steve Evans, out of Ohio University, and his colleagues. And the idea behind the life course model is that you're going to tie evidence-based interventions to problem behavior. So you're not looking for the function now, you're just thinking about evidence-based interventions. So the life course model has 4 layers. We're going to focus primarily on 2 layers. So the first layer are the foundational strategies, which basically means that home and school environments are organized, structured. It's kind of like saying you have to have classroom management really established before you start teaching using behavioral interventions, right? So if your room doesn't have expectations and routines and things are kind of chaotic, then it's going to be difficult to work with a student on one specific behavior. Level 2, in the life course model, they call those psychosocial interventions. I like to think about evidence-based classroom interventions that you can use in a classroom or that counselors can use in counseling sessions. Level 3 is pharmacological, which has nothing to do with us, right? Meds come from doctors, not from us. And layer 4 is accommodations. If you notice that layer 4 is the last set of strategies you're going to look at. So you're going to start with, if we're only interested in layer 2 and layer 4, you're going to start with interventions and then you're going to implement accommodations if you have to. Now understand that we all know you have to implement the accommodations that are on IEPs, but I want you to start thinking about the strategies that are on the IEPs. How many of them are interventions? How many of them are accommodations? Can you use interventions instead of accommodations? I'm not saying don't implement what's on the IEP, but start changing your thinking about what you want to do with the student. So let's start slowly and talk about, make sure that we're still recording. Okay. So we're going to start just like you would if you were going to think about an IEP meeting. So you're going to select interventions that are needed to achieve the goals in the IEPs, right? So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to identify achievable starting points for intervention, which is baseline. And you're going to ultimately monitor student progress. So this is busy and looks complicated. But let me walk you through it, okay? So we start with the life course model with educate parents regarding the life course model. That's not your first step. Your first step is here. So if you look at the PLAFs, what does it say about students' needs, students' strengths, students' challenges? And from those PLAFs, you're going to write a measurable goal, right? From the measurable goal, you're going to look, is it a goal to, and then these are just some behaviors that happen with kids with ADHD, because that's my area of research, but it can be a student with any problem behavior. So let's do it this way. We've got our PLAFs written, right? That happens. You know what those are. You can look at the IEP. The next step, again, measurable goals and objectives. Those come straight from your IEPs. And you can look at these slides in more depth. I expect you to when we're not talking. But let's go here. So the measurable goal is to increase compliant. So is a goal to increase compliant, non-disruptive behavior. Okay, that's a good goal, right? So we want to teach a student to be compliant when it's appropriate and not to demonstrate disruptive behavior. So this sheet correlates to the numbers on this graph. So let's go back. I want to teach Johnny to not be disruptive and to be compliant. So I want to consider interventions 1, 3, and 4. So I want to consider behavioral parent training, daily report card, and classroom point system. Understand that every intervention on this list has research to support it. Okay, so when you do this for yourself, depending on the behavior, you want to think about, is there research to support what you're picking? So you would only pick a strategy here that you know has research to support it. So you're also going to consider, what about those things, right? How feasible are those? How acceptable are those going to be to me as a teacher or to his parents? So is it feasible in my class to use behavioral parent training? Well, if you're a counselor, it's very feasible that you might use behavior parent training with a student's parents if you think they're going to come in, if you think they're going to follow through, right? And you might add some incentives to the parent for them to get to do that. But if you don't think that's feasible, then don't pick that one. The second one was 3. Sorry, am I making you dizzy going back and forth? So the third one is daily report card. Daily report card is an evidence-based intervention and it's feasible. Classroom point system. I'm going to pick one of those to start. I'm not going to pick both. So if it was me, I would probably pick the classroom point system to start with. Okay, so now I've got my intervention. I'm going to work on compliant behavior and I'm going to use a classroom point system. Then I'm going to think, are there other goals that I want to talk about right now? If the answer is yes, then I'm going to go back up here, right? And I'm going to pick the next behavior. Do I want to work on on-task behavior? Maybe I'm not interested in non-compliant. Maybe I want to work on positive peer relations. And I'm going to pick these strategies. And we're going to follow through with this through each set of interventions. So if I want to increase on-task behavior, then I know that strategies 2, 3, 4, and 5 all have evidence for that from the research literature. So 2 is self-management, which is my favorite. 3 is daily report card. 4 is point system. And 5 is note-taking intervention. I also like to teach middle school and high school students how to take notes. So depending on the kid that's struggling, I'm definitely going to pick self-management and I might add note-taking. Makes sense. Remember, these interventions are for kids with ADHD. As you go through this semester, you're going to learn evidence-based interventions. Actually, you're going to teach those on several different mental health issues. And also in this Nearpod, you have found ways of finding evidence-based interventions, right? Okay. So where are we here? So we're going to increase on-task behavior. So what did I say? I'm going to teach him to self-manage. I also could teach him to self-manage compliant behavior and on-task behavior at the same time. Are there other specific goals? Yeah, probably not. So then I'm going to go down here. Are the selected interventions feasible? Let me work you there. You can look at each one of these. It's just adding a different goal as we go through, or a different target behavior. So are there other specific goals to increase? No, I'm going to go here now. So are the interventions feasible that I picked? Yes, because as I was going through it, I thought about it. Sometimes interventions are not feasible. When you read the article that you're assigned this week that talks about talks about acceptability and feasibility of interventions, it talks about the research to practice gap. A big piece of the research to practice gap is that if the interventions aren't feasible, it's not going to happen. So you should pick it. Pick the ones that are feasible. And if it's not, then you better think of another intervention. But let's say it is. Yes, it's feasible. So expectations need to be adjusted at the start of the intervention. So this is when you think about accommodations. So my student is non-compliant. Is there anything that I need to do? Is there any intervention or accommodation I need to give him while I'm teaching? Probably not. But what about increased on-task behavior? What if I pick note-taking instruction and this student does not take notes? Maybe I could give him a copy of teacher notes while I'm teaching him to take notes, right? That would be an intervention and an accommodation. But I want to slowly fade those notes so that I don't give them to him every day. And I'm also going to be really careful because what we're finding out through research is that if they have the accommodation, they're not usually willing to learn the intervention. So you've got to balance that. Then I'm going to identify achievable starting point that's tapered with treatment, kind of just like I talked about just now. And then I'm going to assess his progress based on the 8-4 rule. That means I'm going to collect 8 data points and graph progress. So what did his compliant behavior look like across 8 days? Okay, if the trend is positive and makes no changes or reassess after, if the trend is positive, make no changes and reassess after 8 more data points. If the trend is flat or negative, you want to collect data for 4 data points and then change. And repeat steps 2 and 3. So thinking about those 2 sets of options, I want you to think now. I know it's early to talk about it, but would you rather use an FBA or a life course model to select interventions for students that you're working with? Or do you want to use both? That's not an option, but maybe you can pick both. I'm not sure. I think it's probably forced choice. But think about interventions versus accommodations. Okay, so that's what I have for this activity. I also want to talk to you about your persuasive letter. So the point of your persuasive letter is to pretend like you're demonstrating to an administrator that you understand the importance of school mental health programs. So think about writing a persuasive letter, and what would you say to them to persuade them to use evidence-based strategies within a mental health program at your school? So how do we get a mental health program started? You can use your book. You can use trustworthy sources online, but make sure that you believe what you're reading. You don't need a citation page. You just need 1 page of a letter you're going to send to an administrator. I think that's it. If you have any questions for me this week, feel free to email me. I'm going to look at your Flipgrid for week 1 and actually respond to some of you or all of you. So you want to kind of watch Flipgrid. I'll make an announcement when I do that. And I'm also going to look at your discussion posts from last week. Remember, there are no discussion posts this week. I hope that is helpful. And let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week.